might.
What's up everyone, this is White Pointer bringing you an in-depth analysis video. In this one, I'll be comparing the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive/Genesis versions of the original Mortal Kombat. In one of my previous top 10 lists, the top 10 different games with the same name on the SNES and Mega Drive, I mentioned in my intro that the versions of Mortal Kombat on the SNES and Mega Drive certainly had their differences, but were still essentially the same game. One just had the blood removed and fatalities altered, while the other didn't. But that's kind of oversimplifying it. While both experiences were still Mortal Kombat, the differences ran far deeper than just the blood and fatalities. And so based on some feedback, I decided to put together an in-depth analysis video dedicated specifically to this topic. So which one was actually the better version? I guess a lot of people would instantly say, the Sega version, duh, because it has blood in it. At least once you input the blood code. But that's ignoring the many other areas where the Nintendo version actually had the edge. So the purpose of this video is to thoroughly compare the two, and then let you make your own decision at the end. I am very aware the game was released on many other systems. Game Boy, Game Gear, Amiga, Sega CD, and MS-DOS, the last of which was easily the best one, as well as many arcade-faithful ports to more modern consoles. This video is focusing just on the SNES and Mega Drive versions though, because let's be honest, all of the debate back in the early 90s centered around these two versions. The SNES port was handled by Sculpture's software, while the Mega Drive port was done by Probe software. As saying something is the best can be pretty objective at the best of times, I needed a common denominator to compare against, so I'm using the arcade original as the benchmark. Okay, so let's start with what the characters look like. Here's the character select screen of the arcade version. Now, let's take a look at the Super Nintendo version. Now, here's the Mega Drive version. You'll immediately notice the Mega Drive has far less colour. You'll also notice that the character idle animations here, which are exactly the same in-game, are pretty poor. They're missing at least half of their animation frames, so they just look like they're breathing in and out instead of preparing to fight. To top it off, Sub-Zero's idle animation is totally wrong. Just look at it. That's Scorpion's fighting pose. This is what Sub-Zero's fighting pose is supposed to look like. Come on, Probe, even the crappy Game Boy version got this detail right, and that version sucked. Lastly, Kano has these weird red dots around his sprite for some reason. The actual battle animations fare a little better, but are still clearly missing animation frames. The character sprites are all noticeably a bit smaller, less detailed, and even a bit blurry compared to those on the SNES when you look at them side by side too. While the SNES characters aren't perfect either, they are far, far closer to the arcade. Characters are about the right size, animations are fluid and smooth, and they look more detailed. This is an easy win. Super Nintendo. Alright, let's take a look at some of the backgrounds. As you can see, both console versions here are missing various background details and effects that are found in the arcade original. As with the characters though, you can notice the distinct lack of colour and detail on Sega's console compared to Nintendo's. Some backgrounds also have dynamic elements to them. The monks on the courtyard stage applaud after a bout. Shang Tsung turns his head from side to side as he spectates the fight in his throne room, and also applauds after a bout. This is recreated pretty faithfully on the Super Nintendo. But on the Mega Drive? Well, the monks move on the courtyard stage during the fight, but aside from that, nothing! It's pretty disappointing that they didn't bother to put these little details into the Sega port. Super Nintendo wins this one too. Here's what the arcade version does during its attract mode, showing us character bios.
Scorpion.
And here's what the character ending looks like.
Sonya Sub Scorp Luke Raiden Kano Johnny Sonya Sub Scorp Luke Raiden.
How do the console versions fare here? Obviously, neither console had the capability to replicate the short full-motion video clip the arcade was blessed with in regards to character bios. The Nintendo version shows a quick animation of the character, which is just their win animation from within the game. The Sega version shows a still image of the character, a freeze frame if you will, of the FMV sequence seen on the arcade. Then you had the Goro reveal. Once again, the SNES shows Goro's actual in-game sprite doing a wind pose. Whereas the Sega version shows a near-perfect replica of the image seen on the arcade. Finally, we had the character endings.
Sonya Sub-Zero Scorpion Liu Kang Raiden Kano Johnny Cage.
Again, the SNES just shows the in-game sprite doing a wind pose, while text scrolls on the screen.
Get over here!
While the Mega Drive shows a unique image with text on a stone background, just like the arcade. While the actual Shang Tsung death sequence is much more faithful to the arcade on the SNES, that's not enough to make up for the lack of effort elsewhere. It's pretty clear who the winner is in this category. Sega gets one back. Okay, I know this one is going to be one of the most contentious, because I know that everyone has different tastes in music, and what someone likes, someone else will dislike. Believe me, as a musician myself, I understand that. The two versions have very distinctly different sounding music, and you may be a fan of one or the other. But once again, I need to compare against the arcade original. So here's some music from the arcade. Here's the same track on the SNES. And now here's the same track on the Mega Drive. Here's another few tracks to compare. I'll shut up for a moment so you can have a good listen to them. So it sounds okay between them at first listen, but I think even the most stalwart of Sega fans would agree that the instrumentation on Nintendo's console is closer to the source material, despite it sounding a bit more subdued and less punchy than the arcade. The Sega music sounds fine, it's just not as close to the arcade as the SNES. However, dig a little deeper and you'll find that Sega's music is, well, wrong and incomplete. The majority of the tracks on the Sega version are either on the wrong stage or just completely different. For example, the Pit's music track is played on the throne room stage.
Fight! Fight!
And the track that's actually on the Pit stage on Sega isn't found on the arcade at all.
Fight!
So where's the arcade's throne room stage music then? Not there in the game. The track that plays on the Palace Gate stage on Sega is actually the arcade's continue music.
Fight!
So where's the arcade's Palace Gates music then? It plays on the Warrior Shrine.
Fight! Fight!
It doesn't even have a unique track for Goro's Lair. Instead, it uses the Game Over music.
Fight!
Goro's Lair's music isn't in the game at all. Are you serious? This kick-ass music is not in the Mega Drive version. Neither is the arcade's Warrior Shrine music for that matter. In addition to this, many music tracks such as the battle plan, versus screen, unique finishing themes for each stage, and victory music when you beat Shang Tsung and see the ending are missing completely. Why? The Mega Drive only uses 15 unique music tracks, whereas the Super Nintendo and arcade have more than double that with 31. What the heck happened here? It just comes across as lazy and half-assed. Now, I want to make it clear here that I don't think the Sega version's music is bad. In fact, it's fine when taken on its own merit. All I'm saying is that the Nintendo version's music does a better job of replicating the arcade. Even though the SNES's music sounds a bit muffled, the correct tracks are on the correct stages, the instrumentation is closer to the arcade, and it contains pretty much all of the original tracks. You're free to continue liking the Sega music if that's your thing, but comparing to the arcade, the Super Nintendo comfortably wins this.
Fight!
Let's have a listen to the various sound effects in the game. As usual, arcade first.
Johnny Cage. Sub-Zero. Fight! Sub-Zero wins.
Now the SNES.
Johnny Cage. Sub-Zero. Fight! Sub-Zero wins.
Now the Mega Drive.
Fight!
Notice anything missing on the Sega version? Almost all of the voice samples, including the announcements of all the character names, are completely missing. They just aren't there at all. Not only that, but most of the grunts and groans when characters are hit are also completely missing. All you hear is a dull thud most of the time. Even Liu Kang's trademark high-pitched squalling isn't there. He has the same generic voice as all the others. At least Scorpion's iconic line, "Get over here," was left intact. The special move sound effects are meagre too. They are jarring, distorted, and sound nothing like the arcade. The Super Nintendo version sounds aren't spot on either, mind you. The sounds the various male characters make are generally much more high-pitched than the arcade version, but at least they are there. The special move sound effects are also closer to the arcade. This is a huge area where Probe Software really dropped the ball. There's really no excuse for such a poor effort here. Super Nintendo easily wins this round.
Fight!
So on the arcade, the controls were laid out in a 5-button configuration: high and low punch, high and low kick, and block. You could hit directions at the same time as buttons to perform more advanced moves like sweeps, roundhouses, throws, and uppercuts. Special moves and fatalities were generally executed by inputting a combination of directions followed by a button. On the Super Nintendo, high punch, high kick, and low kick were mapped to the face buttons, and block was either of the two triggers. It worked pretty well. On the Mega Drive's default 3-button controller, both punches are combined and mapped to A, low kick is B, and high kick is C, while start is the block button. This was probably the best they could do with the button restrictions, but it was cumbersome and borderline unplayable. Thank goodness then that the game actually supported the 6-button controller as well. This worked much better. All standard moves were accounted for and no awkward pressing of start to block. Weirdly though, throws were executed by pressing forward and high kick rather than forward and low punch, and some moves that could normally only be executed with either high punch or low punch, not both, could still be executed by pressing either punch button. Scorpion Spear, for example, can work by pressing back low punch and back high punch. So it still wasn't 100% arcade accurate, but it was still a no-brainer to use the 6-button controller if you had one. Because of that small lack of arcade accuracy on the Mega Drive though, even using the 6-button controller, the SNES wins this. Outside of the blood and gore, this is probably the most debated difference between these two versions. The Mega Drive version runs slightly faster than the SNES version and has more responsive controls. On the SNES, there's a definite noticeable delay between when you press the button and the action occurring on screen. It was difficult for me to put my finger on exactly how laggy the SNES controls really were, so I measured it. If you believe the SNES version didn't have input lag, then this should convince you. I recorded some footage alongside my button input and played the video back frame by frame in VLC to determine exactly how long it took for the game to respond after I push a button. This is the arcade original. I press the button here and there's 1, 2, 3 frames of lag, then the character responds. This is the Mega Drive version. I press the button here, there's 1, 2 frames of input lag, so it's actually slightly faster than even the arcade. Now the SNES version. I press the button here, now there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames of input lag. In actual fact, the SNES version was a bit inconsistent and fluctuated between 6 and 8 frames of lag, and oddly, D-pad directions seemed laggier than buttons. The lag on the D-pad input took between 9 and 12 frames to respond. Check this out. I press D-pad down here and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 frames before the character begins to crouch. What the hell? All of that may not seem like much on paper, but think about it. That's at least 3 to 4 times slower than Sega's console, and you definitely feel it. When playing, it feels worse than it actually is, to be honest. Not only did it have input delay, but even worse, the input delay seemed to randomly vary, so it wasn't even the same delay each time. It's nothing you can't get used to, but this delay is most definitely not in the arcade version. Another oversight on the SNES version was the pushback mechanic if you were trapped in a corner. If the opponent starts attacking you in the corner, after a few hits, the game will push them away to allow you to escape. It seems like they forgot to add this to the SNES port, so you could be trapped in an infinite combo if you're unlucky. However, due to the Mega Drive's smaller character sprites and slightly wider aspect ratio, there's actually more horizontal space to work with when playing. The SNES feels a bit more cramped in comparison, but it's also strangely closer to how the arcade original feels. Neither version is totally arcade accurate, and each version takes elements from the arcade but lacks another. The clincher, I think though, is that awful input lag on the SNES, since control responsiveness is a really important thing, especially in fighting games. It honestly makes the SNES version feel very clunky and unresponsive. That's inexcusable on Sculptured Software's part, and that's enough for Sega to take the win in this category. And now, we finally come to the ultimate difference, the elephant in the room, the blood and fatalities. The SNES version was censored due to Nintendo's policies at the time, replacing the blood with sweat and replacing several of the more violent fatalities. The Sega version was also censored by default, but provided the cheat code to unlock the blood and real fatalities. So let's take a look at the fatality comparisons.
Scorpion wins. Flawless victory. Fatality. Scorpion wins. Sonya wins. Sonya wins.
As you can see, Scorpion, Sonya and Liu Kang's fatalities are all identical across the arcade, Nintendo and Sega versions. What does Johnny Cage do?
Johnny Cage wins. Johnny Cage wins.
What the hell is that?
Alright then. What about Kano?
Kano wins. Kano
Slightly better.
wins.
Oh, well what does Raiden do?
Raiden wins.
Raiden's SNES fatality is actually pretty cool, and the general concept was reused in later Mortal Kombat games. What about Sub-Zero's fatality?
Sub-Zero wins.
Actually, that's also pretty good. And in fact, this was adapted into one of his actual fatalities in Mortal Kombat 2. Check this out. The pit stage fatality is also more or less the same, apart from the spurt of blood at the end. Although, it doesn't work at all on Sega without the blood code. The bottom of the pit also has corpses and decapitated heads impaled on spikes in the arcade version that both console versions lack. So while the SNES does have some decent replacements, the Sega version is still the more arcade accurate one, but only if you use the blood code. Mind you, it's still not quite as much blood and gore as the arcade original has, but it's better than nothing. Sega takes this category. So, that's the end of the analysis, and we see the Super Nintendo version winning in the categories of characters, backgrounds, music, sound effects, and controls, while the Mega Drive version won the categories of presentation, gameplay, and blood and fatalities. I'll leave it to you now to decide what version actually wins overall. Is it the SNES, with its crisper visuals, more complete sound and arcade-accurate controls? Or is it the Mega Drive, with its faster and more responsive gameplay, better presentation, and the option of the blood code? What's your vote? Let me know in the comments below, and give me a thumbs up if you liked the video. Thanks for watching!